Okay, good morning, everyone. Now, apologies for the slight mix-up in the lectures. I scheduled one for 9, which is wrong, obviously, but it looks like there's plenty of participants here anyway, so that's good. Now, can I just check that people are hearing me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Good. So today's lecture is, in terms of structure now, it's going to be slightly different from other lectures. It's going to be mainly me just talking through code, I suppose, really, rather than too many slides. There's only going to be 3 or 4 slides that I'm going to step through, which are these ones here. I haven't actually put them up on Moodle at all yet, and the context for this lecture is we're going to look at CI/CD for a web API. But of course, maybe this is the part that will catch your attention, that really this is kind of a preparation for assignment 2, because assignment 2 is going to be about developing a CI/CD pipeline for the web API that you are developing in the web app module, but also for the second assignment for that other module. So that's the kind of context. Now, what I've done is I've taken the web API that you are developing in the other module, and I've implemented a CI/CD pipeline for that. And I will give you that code and we'll work on it in next week's labs. By the way, now there will be no more lab submissions for this module. I'm sure you're delighted to hear that. So the one that you submitted yesterday was the last lab submission for this. But unfortunately, there is a second assignment. And I will give you a formal kind of specification for the second assignment next week. But I've kind of given you the overview of it in what I've just said there a few moments ago. It's going to be developing a CI/CD pipeline for the second assignment that you're going to be doing on the other module. Right, so if I maybe step my way through these slides and explain some kind of background stuff as well. Now I am going to try and turn off my camera. Okay. Now, if I just flip over to VS Code, what you're seeing here is essentially what you are developing in the web API module. And what I have is the movies API as it existed after last week's lab in that module. So I brought in Mongoose and we're talking to a database. I haven't brought in any of the JWT and authentication material that Frank is covering this week with you, or has covered this week with you, and you are doing in this week's lab. I don't have that implemented, but I have all of the stuff that you would have implemented in last week's lab. So for example, if I go into the API folder, we have a movies API and we have a users API, and this is all familiar to you from that module. So in the movies API, essentially all we're doing is sending requests to TMDB, And in the users API, as you know, that's where we're actually talking to a database and we're storing users in our database. That's all we're doing at the moment. We're able to register a user, and we can get we can update a user, and we can get all users. Okay, so that looks familiar to you from last week. Now I've gone away and I've written a small number of tests for both of those endpoints, as we'd call them. They're not completed tests though, but there's enough there to get us going. But before I start talking about testing and all that kind of stuff, I want to take kind of a step back. Now, at the moment, what you do in the labs with Frank is you typically, when you want to run your web API, you type npm start at this level here. And what's going on there is, if we look inside the package.json, we are running this script here. Sorry, this one here. And what is that doing? That's essentially, okay, we're using something called NodeMon. Or NodeMon is a utility that is going to monitor your files to see if you've made any changes. But the kind of really more relevant stuff is what's going on over here. We're using a tool called Babel Node. Now, what Babel Node does is, Babel we're kind of familiar with. What it actually does is it takes this file that you're giving it, index.js, which is this guy down here, essentially the base of our API implementation. And of course, inside an index.js, we're importing the API files up here, etc., etc. So what Babel Node does, as you may already know, is it takes this file and then it grabs all of the imports that it uses and all of the other imports that are being used by the other files, and it transpiles all of that code back to ES5 code. And having done that, then it then starts up the node application, and it gets that node application to run your API. And then you can send HTTP requests to it. So this idea that Babel Node is actually transpiling all of your code back to ES5, because the reason it needs to do that is because the Node platform itself, it cannot run modern JavaScript. It's gradually getting nearer and nearer to being able to run more current kind of JavaScript syntax, but it's lagging by, I'm not sure, maybe about a couple of years maybe. So Babel has to transpile all of your code, which has been written in more ES6 plus syntax, and transpiles it back to ES5 form, and then it gives that to the actual Node platform itself, and Node then runs the application for you. Now that's fine when you're working in development mode, but that's no good if you want to actually deploy your API onto some sort of cloud service. The cloud service platform can't be transpiling and doing all of that for you at runtime anyway. So in terms of building a CI/CD pipeline for our web API, one thing we're going to have to do is we're going to have to kind of build a production version of our web API. In other words, do the kind of transpilation ourselves. So if I go back to my slides, so that's fine. That's when you're running in development mode. We have all of this nice stuff like watching and live reloading. Live reloading is, if we make a change to one of our source code, then NodeMon will detect that, and NodeMon will essentially tell Babel Node, do all of your stuff again. So it does all its transpilation and kicks off a new node node instance, kind of, if you like, to serve up your web API. But we must actually build our code for use in production. And we're going to use Babel to do that for us again. And so when I compile or build a version of my API and I put it into a local folder, so it's a bit like bundling in the React world. And in my case, here is my folder. And inside and build, you have your entire, including node modules, of course, because we need that to run our application in production. But we have the exact same kind of folder structure that we have down here in our source code. So we have an API folder. Inside there, there's a movies folder, and there's an index.js and a movies.js. And if I just look inside this index.js, it's similar to our code. I mean, here are our roots, they look familiar, but it is using, one thing, for example, is it's using all of the ES5 type import statements. This require is the equivalent of an import in ES6. And there are some other slight differences as well. We never need to worry about this because this is produced for us by Babel. So how did I create this build folder? Well, in my package.json, I've got a number of entries put into it. It's quite long-winded actually, but essentially all of these guys here are compiling the various parts of my source code. It's quite long-winded. I guess if I knew, you can see in each one of them, like what I'm doing is I'm using the Babel tool. I'm telling it where is the code that I want to have transpiled. And here I'm telling it where I wanted to put that transpiled code. Now, I have to actually kind of transpile each individual folder part of my source individually. It would be nice if I could do this in just one command, just tell Babel, take my index.js and follow the paths from there to do an entire build, but I haven't been able to work out to get it to do that, so I have to kind of compile individual parts of it. You can see there's a whole series of them here. I've got one command then, this one here, and really all that is doing is, this is another special little node package, the npm run all. The npm run all package, which is one of my dependencies down below, somewhere down here. There it is there. What it does is you can give it a list of some other scripts that you have defined elsewhere within your package.json, and it'll essentially run each of those individually. So that's collectively all of those compile commands are building a production version of my my API. And I've got another little one thing here, which is a task script called clean. What it does is it essentially deletes the build folder. Rimraf is another npm package, and really all rimraf does is it you can use it to delete a folder, and I'm recreating the folder again. So every time I want to build my API, I run the clean task, and then I essentially run the compile all task, and that will build a production version of my API. In fact, I have a task here that's doing that. You can see this one here. All it's doing is it's cleaning out the build folder, and then it's running all of my compiles. So anytime I run this post install, I've called it post install now for another reason. It's an odd kind of name, but we'll get to later on as to why I called it that. If I run that task, that script, sorry, that will build a new version of my web API. It'll create this build folder, in other words, and put it in there. So that's how I would build my API if I wanted to deploy it to some sort of cloud service. Next, in terms of building a CI/CD pipeline, presumably you want to write some tests for your application, and it's conventional. Well, sorry, before I just move on now, is there anything about what I've spoken about here that people want to question me on, or are you okay in it? I mean, really, I could just do it from the command line here. If I just go npm run, and it's going through all of the compiles individually. Let's see. Yeah, it's just doing all of the compiles individually there. So it's nothing terribly interesting, but it's as straightforward as that. Now, in terms of writing tests, go back to my slides. It's conventional that you would have one test file per what I'm calling endpoint in your API. So we have two endpoints in our API, the movies endpoint and the user's endpoint. So we'd have one test file for each of those. You could have others as well, but that's as a minimum. Now, in terms of test isolation, there are a couple of things that we need to be aware of, and one or two of them turned up the last day when we were doing our web API testing. It's this idea that we need to reload our Express server between each test in order to guarantee test isolation. Now, something that didn't arise last week in our labs, but it does this week, and that is that, and it's mainly because in the API that I have now, my API is talking to a database. In the API that we wrote tests for last week, that wasn't the case. You might remember we had an in-memory database. So when we started to introduce the database, that kind of introduced some other little problems as well. But the main upshot of the fact that our API is now going to be communicating with an external service, essentially, i.e. a database, then between each test case, we actually have to release port 8080 so that when the Express server restarts for the next test case, we've got to make sure that port 8080 is available. If we don't do that, then you're going to get errors in your tests telling you that the particular port that you're trying to access is already occupied by another service. And of course, it's the previous execution of port 8080. Even though we've kind of reloaded the server, the port is still occupied, if you like. So we do, that's another little gotcha, which I've given you a solution for in the code, as we'll see in a second. The third thing is that in terms of test isolation, we should really recreate our database tables between each test case in order to guarantee test case isolation. So just those aspects, if we look at the code for my tests, which is in here. So if we look at the movies one first, that's the least interesting one because as you know now, the movies endpoint isn't using the database at all. So far anyway, unless Frank decides to bring in some more stuff next week. So just scanning down through this, Not sure if there's anything terribly new going on here. We've seen this before. This is where I'm loading or importing the Express server, if you like. This is actually how I effect releasing the port. If I just call this close method on my Express server, then that will release the port, and then I'm flushing the Express server code from my node modules cache. So that's the only one. If I take that out now, then my tests are going to throw errors back to me, essentially saying, and you can do it yourselves, I'll give you this code next week. If you comment that out, then you'll get an error saying that port 8080 is already occupied. The first test will run fine, but the second test case won't. The actual tests themselves then are fairly straightforward. They're not complete, though I need to do some more work on them. But as you know now, the movies endpoint in the API, all it's really doing is it's proxying to the TMDB API. So when we make a request to our web API, to the movies part of it, it just sends the request onto TMDB, the response comes back from TMDB, and our web API sends us that response back. There's no database interaction going on there. If we look at the users tests, so the users endpoint, as you know, is using the database. And so I'm actually importing Mongoose into this case as well, because what I want to do in this test case is I want to talk to the database directly. I don't want to go, I want to bypass the web API. And the reason I want to talk to the database directly is because between each test, individual test in my test file, I want to essentially reset the database tables back to some initial state. In my case, I want to put 2 users into the database and have the same 2 users in the database before each individual test case. So moving on down, okay, here are the 2 users that I'm going to be putting into my database each time. And so there's a lot going on here now. In the before block, I make a connection to my database. This is kind of similar to the code that you have in your web API implementation. I'm connecting to my database. Don't worry about these settings. These are just some defaults that I have to use, but they're just boilerplate really. And here I get a connection. And I set my variable DB, which I've called up here, just declared up here. So DB is my connection to the database server, if you like. At the very end, when all of my tests are finished, I actually essentially destroy any tables that have been created during this test. And that again is good from a test isolation perspective, in that the next time I want to run my tests, I want to make sure that the database has the exact same, has nothing in it essentially each time. So that's before and after. In the before each then, here I'm actually, again, I'm just importing my web API. This is the interesting stuff though from a database point of view. And you're familiar with this code, okay? I'm cleaning out all of the entries in my users table. User here is the user schema that I'm importing here on top. This is the user schema, our users model that Frank has talked about with you. So I am specifically accessing the users collection in my database here, cleaning out all the entries in it, and I'm putting a new set of entries into that collection. And what am I putting in? I'm putting in these 2 users up here. So I'm doing that between each test case. This is my before each block. And after each test case, again, I have to release port 8080 of the Web API Express server and I'm flushing out the node modules cache. So it's really, I guess, it's really this stuff here and, you know, the other Mongoose stuff that's kind of new. But all of that is necessary to guarantee test isolation when you're, if you've got a particular part of your API that's using the database. The tests themselves, again, are not that interesting, and they're not complete either, but you can look at them yourselves. Any questions on that before I move on? Now, next is deployment or hosting. We didn't do this now when we were doing the front end, but it is going to be part of the back end assignment too, really, I suppose. So it's CI/CD, where we're actually taking care of the CD part as well. So I want to deploy my web API onto some cloud hosting service, and there are many of them out there. The one that I'm using and the one that you will use, you can use another one if you want to, but the one that I'm using is Heroku. So Heroku is a platform, a cloud hosting platform, and amongst other things, you can host Node web APIs on this platform. You can host other types of applications as well, Ruby ones, Java ones, Python ones, etc., etc. So you will have to go away and create an account on the Heroku service. Maybe at this stage I could flip over to my browser. And I've already registered with Heroku. And so here's my kind of home page, if you like. This is my home page. And here are some applications that I have deployed onto the Heroku platform. And in my case, as you can see over on the right here, they're actually all Node ones, but that's just a coincidence. I was using it for Ruby as well. Now, this is the one that I'm working on at the moment. Sorry, this one here, sorry, yeah. This is my movies API hosted on it. So, when you create an account on Heroku in the usual way, you will be given an API key, a bit like TMDB and indeed Cypress dashboard. And that's going to be necessary because when you are deploying something to Heroku, you have to tell Heroku what your API key is so that it can authenticate that you are allowed to deploy to their platform. So you get an API key when you register with them. The Heroku platform also comes with a number of command line tools that you could install on your own machine. The only problem, though, is you have to have the Ruby language already installed on your machine. Now, I have purposefully avoided that, and you won't have to do it either. But just to let you know that there are some CLI tools. Now, we will be using one particular command line interface tool in our GitLab environment, and it's this DLP tool. DLP is short for deployment. So this is a tool or a command that you can issue from the command line when you want to essentially deploy something up on Heroku. By deploy, we really mean that you're pushing your code up to Heroku and it will host your application there. And you'll see this DLP command in my GitLab YAML file in a few minutes. But so it is Ruby based, and there are kind of issues concerned with installing Ruby on your own machine. So I've stayed away from that really. You could also, if you had Ruby already, then it's quite possible that you could install. This is essentially a package, the equivalent of a package in the Node world, Ruby doesn't call them packages. Ruby calls them gems. So you can install various gems on your own machine, but there's no need to do that. And I would stay away from it if I were you, really. Fortunately, Heroku also has a web interface, and that's what you're seeing here. So you can do lots of things with your hosted applications, like set environment variables, find out what kind of state they're in, are they running or not. If I go into this one, you know, you can, there's various tabs here. You can see how much usage is happening to your web API. In other words, how many hits is it getting, et cetera, what happened to the various, how many times did you deploy it, were they successful, and so on and so forth. In the settings section, which is really the only section that you will probably need to go into, is where you can set environment variables that you want to have available to your application. And that's very important for us because we are going to have to set our TMDB key environment variable in there and some other environment variables as well, because our code is using environment variables. The MongoDB environment variable would be another one. So that's the web interface for the Heroku platform. And I've already made this point here that we must set environment variables. You set environment variables on a per application basis. You saw there on in my account, in my Heroku account, I had a number of applications. So you would set environment variables on an application level. Now, how does the fact that you are deploying your application to Heroku, how does that impact on your source code? Very, very little, as it turns out. There's just two things. One thing is you have to have a special file called the proc file on as part of your code base. And you can see that down there at the bottom. There's my proc file. Now, can I just go back for 1 second? And the reason I need to do it is because it will make the proc file contents a little bit more meaningful. I was talking earlier on about building a production version of my web API. And in my case, the built production version is inside in this folder called build. Now, what that now means is that I can actually run my web API just as an ordinary node application. And to prove that to you, if you want to run any node application from the command line, then what you do is you type node, because we have node already installed, and you give it the main file in the particular application that you want to run. Now, in my case, that file is down in the build folder, and it's the index.js file. So if I run that now, I'm now running my node application, my node web API locally. There's no live reloading or any of that going on now. This is just an ordinary running of a node application locally. Okay, I'm getting my message back from my server, which is good, telling me it's running on port 8080. What this stuff is here, I am using the MongoDB cloud service as my database. That will become important for you as well. So that's where this message is coming from. But other than that, my server seems to be up and running. And to prove it to myself, if I go over to the browser, and go to localhost 8080, which you would normally, but in my case now, it's the home page. And if I just do an API request, now Frank was using Postman, but if I can do an ordinary GET request from here. So if I go API/movies, yeah, that's working. And the other one was API/users. and that's working as well. So now, what's the point? Why did I divert into that? So that's the command there if I want to run my production version of my web API, no build index.js. And really, if I look inside the proc file, which is where I came to, all you've got to put into the proc file is you've got to tell Heroku, how does it start your application? That's the command. So Heroku will actually issue that command in order to start your application. You've also kind of got to tell Heroku what type of application is it. And in our case, it's a web-based application. There are other types as well. So that's all that's in the Heroku. That's all that's in the proc file, but it's critical. Otherwise, Heroku can't actually start up your application for you. The other thing you have to, the other impact that the fact that I'm deploying my application to Heroku has on my source code is there is one particular script entry that I have to put in my package.json. And you have to name that script post install. And what that script does is it tells Heroku how does it actually build your application. Because what you upload to Heroku is your source code. In other words, what you would upload to your GitHub or GitLab repository. Because behind the scenes, Heroku actually has its own private Git repository, and it stores all of the applications that are hosted on Heroku. It stores them inside an individual Git repositories. You can't access that repository directly, but that's what it's doing behind the scenes. So when you deploy, in the case of Heroku, other deployment hosting platforms are different, but in the case of Heroku, what you essentially push up to Heroku is your source code. That means that Heroku needs to actually build your application locally. And in the case of a node-based application, what Heroku does is it looks in the package.json for a script with this specific name, and it runs that script. And in our case, surprise, surprise, if I look in my package.json, there's the post installed script, and it's cleaning out the build folder. It's cleaning out the actual build folder. It's cleaning out the build folder up in the Heroku site. Now it's creating and then it's running my compile all. All right. So that's just, as I said, that's how Heroku works. Secondly, in the case of deployment, I am going to be using MongoDB Cloud to store my kind of database. So my Heroku web API is going to be talking to my database, which is over on a different platform. And that's not uncommon. Now, I know Frank has mentioned MongoDB Cloud Tree in one of his labs. Okay, it was optional in his lab, but I would recommend you to do it for my assignment, and indeed it might be useful for your second assignment in the web API module as well. If you know of an alternative to MongoDB Cloud, in other words, if you know of an alternative cloud platform that allows you to host MongoDB databases, then that's fine. You can use that. I'm not too pushed. But I am using MongoDB Cloud as well. So in my case, here's my MongoDB Cloud cluster that I've set up for myself. And MongoDB talks about projects. So I've just got one project. And if I drill down into that, into the collections part, in the collections is where you create databases. It's kind of badly named, really. but in the collection section, you can create individual databases. So these are individual databases. Now you might think that this is the database that I'm using, but it's not actually. It's a database called test. And if I expand that, what I see here are the collections in my test database. And at the moment, I've only got one collection, my users collection. So test is my database, users is my collection up on, and this happens to be the name of my cluster, which is kind of language that MongoDB Cloud uses. So that's fine. I've set that up for myself, and it's pretty straightforward, really, in terms of setting up MongoDB Cloud. I know Frank has kind of given you instructions on it, so you might do it yourselves over the weekend or whatever, early next week, just to get familiar with it. But other than that, once you set it up, the other thing I should mention is what you will also need to do is create essentially some users for your user accounts, I suppose, for your MongoDB instances up in this cloud service. Now I've created 3 of them. You won't need all 3 actually. All you need is one that has admin access. When you're creating these users, you can nominate what type of access the users have. Now I've given actual names to the users that reflect the kind of access that they have, but that's only a convenience for me. So the read user can only read data from my databases. The read-write user can do both. Admin user can do things like delete a database, which is actually something that my tests need. My test case, when I showed you my test there, it actually was trying to send a request to drop a database. So you need to have admin access in order to do that. That's that. The last piece of the jigsaw is CI/CD. And surprise, surprise, we're going to be using GitLab for CI/CD. And we're pretty familiar with all of this already, fortunately. There's one thing, though, that didn't occur when we were using GitLab for the React assignment and the React work. GitLab has this concept of services as well. And of particular importance to us is the MongoDB service. So what this service allows you to do is it allows you to get GitLab to actually boot up a MongoDB server for you as it's running through your CI/CD pipeline. And that's going to be useful for us because when we run our tests, what we can do is have our tests access a MongoDB server that's running up on GitLab for us. So if I look at the YAML file associated with GitLab for this particular project, now there's no more Cypress and all of that. If I go back to the very beginning, just the first thing to note is, I'm not sure when I was talking about GitLab tree, I gave you some of the background, but you know this idea of we have stages and we have jobs, and a stage comprises of a number of jobs. So these are jobs here. And the way it actually works behind the scenes is essentially each job is run on a separate virtual machine. More correctly, each job is executed within a separate Docker container. Now, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Docker containers, but you can think of Docker containers as lightweight virtual machines. So each job is executed on its own lightweight machine. And for each lightweight machine, you've got to tell GitLab, well, what operating system should it install on that lightweight machine? And are there any other libraries or utilities that it should include in the lightweight virtual machine or Docker container? Now, for this particular case, I want my Docker container or my lightweight virtual machine to have Node, the latest version of Node, pre-installed on it. And so that's essentially what I'm telling GitLab here. Run a virtual machine that has the Node platform installed on it. This is the variables we had before, the caching we had before. We're going to be caching our Node modules between each job for obvious reasons. Here's the services section. Now, these two simple lines, the effect of these two lines in my YAML file will be to get GitLab to start up a MongoDB server for us. It's as simple as that. And in my case, my stages are kind of familiar. I have an install, build, test, and I have a staging stage and a deploy stage. In my staging stage, I am going to be, even though the name is kind of slightly confusing, I am actually going to be deploying my application to Heroku. In the deploy, but the deployment, the staging deployment typically would be a deployment of the application that's only available to the software development team itself. You can also deploy, or you may also want to deploy your application to your production environment. That is the environment where your users actually use your application. So we do keep them separate. And if we look down through the jobs, you know, they kind of look familiar. The install job, that just runs npm install on our application. So it installs all our Node modules. This is the build that I was talking about. So I'm running npm run compile all. I'm building my application locally up on GitLab, I guess. The test, I'm running my tests, no surprises there. And here's a new stage now, the deploy, what I've called deploy staging, and it's part of the staging stage. And what I want to do in this job here is I want to deploy my application up to Heroku. Now, at the top of my file here, I'm saying I want to use this virtual machine image for all of my jobs, but you can actually override that and you can have a slightly different virtual machine for individual jobs if that arises. And it does arise in this case, because for this particular job here, I want a virtual machine instance that has Ruby already installed on it. And that's really what I'm doing here. I'm telling GitLab, use this virtual machine image instead. It won't have, I don't think it has Node actually, because I don't need Node, but I do need the Ruby language installed. Now, why do I need that? It's because of what's going on down here. What I'm doing here is I'm installing the Heroku CLI tools, and in particular, I'm installing the DLP Heroku tool or gem. This is boilerplate, which you can use as well. So I'm installing the Heroku deployment command line tool, and here is where I'm actually using it. So this line here is getting GitLab to deploy my application up to Heroku. This is something that you could run from your own local machine as well if you had the Ruby language installed and if you had the Heroku CLI tools installed. But I've mentioned before why we're actually not doing that. So here's where I'm deploying my application, and you can see I am using a lot of environment variables. So up in GitLab, I need to set all of these environment variables. This environment variable is going to be referring to the name of my application in Heroku. This is obviously going to be referring to the Heroku API key that I was given that's unique to me. So that allows Heroku to identify who I am and where my account is on the Heroku service. And once it has done that, this is telling Heroku which particular application am I deploying to? Because you saw there a few moments ago, I had a number of applications deployed to Heroku. So I need to tell it which particular one should it essentially overwrite. So that line takes care of doing the auto deployment for me. So I'm conscious of time now. Okay, there's lots of environment variables that you have to set up in GitLab. And if I just quickly switch over to GitLab, here we are. You can see I ran a build there just this morning. Here are my 4 stages: my install, my build, my test, and my deploy. In terms of environment variables, okay, my Heroku API key, my Heroku app name staging. I've come up with this name myself. These names are arbitrary, really. You can use whatever names you want, but they make sense, I guess. My MongoDB, I can actually, if we look at this one actually, because we know now that I am running a MongoDB server up in GitLab, or I've asked GitLab to start up a MongoDB server for me. So in terms of the how I actually access that, the URL for that, this is something that wouldn't be obvious, but this is the URL to access a MongoDB server that's running up in GitLab for you. And test is the name of that I've chosen for my database. The rest is just a reference to the MongoDB server that GitLab has created for me. Again, I will get you to set up all of this next week. I'll give you the source code, and then what you will need to do in next week's lab is set up the GitLab CI/CD project. I'm going to give you the actual YAML file. You should probably create a Heroku account in preparation, and maybe create a MongoDB cloud account as well. Do all of that as prep work. And I think I'm kind of running out of time really, but right, so there's a lot there really, and really maybe when I get you to work through it in next week's lab, it will hopefully make a little bit more sense. And as I said, it's kind of important because it's prep work for the second assignment. Okay, as usual, it's all a bit rushed at the end, but so I'll talk to you again on Monday. In next week's lecture, I will talk through the assignment 2 specification. I'll publish it a day or two prior to that, hopefully. So there won't be any more new material, if you like, that I have to cover, but we've covered quite a lot, in fairness. Okay, that's it for now. I don't know if there are any short questions before I close the meeting. Just before I do people have anything to ask me?
Yes, I still have a question.
Sure.
Yeah, in the test staging, do we just need to test the application built locally in GitLab instead of testing the application hosting in Heroku?
No, you're testing it against the locally built one on GitLab.
Okay.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. That's how we're doing it. How do I know that? How do you know that? In the tests, we're actually now that I think about it, slight correction. You're actually testing it against the the pre-built one.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's still against a version, an instance that's running up in GitLab. Either way, it's not the Heroku one.
Okay.
Good. Anything else? No. Okay. Don't forget to watch the match on Sunday. See what you think of it, and I'll talk to you on Monday. All right. Bye for now.
Bye, sir.